Y'all are disappointed to see just me. Well, Mary is here. She's just behind the camera again.
I'm here.
So there she is. But I'm glad you're back with us this afternoon to carry on with the history of the ranch cattle industry in Oklahoma, part 2. Now, just to kind of recap, bring you up to speed from where we were last week, we kind of ended with the situation with the Cheyenne Arapaho, who were the they were leasing land to ranchers to allow them to graze their cattle on their lands. And of course, it resulted in income for the Cheyenne Arapahos. There was a letter called the Finland letter that was sent, and it was like, the government's not going to uphold any of the leases, but we're not going to get in the way of anybody making leases. In other words, we're not really doing anything. It was kind of an absurd letter. But the War Department refused to furnish any troops to help patrol and keep the peace there, where these people who wanted a lease weren't getting them, and the ones who had them were having trouble keeping them. All this fighting was going on. And so then General Sheridan from the Civil War renown was sent with available troops to quiet the trouble. And the president at last ordered that all the cattle be removed from the reservation within 40 days. So that's where we stopped. Well, the number of cattle on the reservation was estimated about 210,000 head. So I thought, let's look at how vast the area of this free range cattle ranching really was. So down here, this is Oklahoma, and you can see on another map that I've looked at before, where the Longhorn procurement area was right down here in this really the lowest point in Texas. But the cattle, they were shipped they went on the cattle drives to take them to get on the railroads, but then they also brought them up here. If they didn't put them on a train and sell them to, can you see that map very well? I think it looks too bright, like it's too bright on it a little bit. Maybe we need a little more contrast. Oh, there we go. There we go. A little more contrast. That maybe not quite that much. But anyway, they would send them up to these grazing areas to fatten them up before they shipped them out to the northeast part of the United States. And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to see how vast this ranch and ranch cattle area really was. I mean, you can see why ranchers of those days were men of prestige and power and wealth, because they really had to, they had millions of cattle, no doubt, grazing all of those acres of land. So anyway, I thought that would be kind of an interesting picture. This picture it's a little bit hard to see because it's black and white, but this is the blizzard of 1886. Now, this was the winter of 1885 and went into 1886, and this was the same time that the president said, okay, no more cattle allowed in the Cheyenne Arapaho lands. They estimated at least 210,000 head of cattle, probably more. But this winter was very harsh, and it actually impacted that whole range, that whole area we saw on the previous map. Some estimated that 75% of the cattle died that winter because of starvation and exposure to this terrible blizzard. You can see that here's like a pole, fence post, the cars, the trucks, actually, they may be trying to clear some kind of road. I mean, I'm gonna guess this drift is about 10 foot tall. It was a crazy, terrible winter. The following winter, the 86-87 winter, was equally bad. So cattle herds really went down as far as numbers in the herds. But this was devastating to the ranchers who had been forced to move their cattle off of good grazing areas where in Oklahoma, this was an especially bad winter, but the winters were not as bad in Oklahoma as they were in other states. I mean, the same as today, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, those states all have much worse winters. Remember, we're talking about the Cherokee Strip, which was the very northern part of Oklahoma. This is kind of the area where the land was that we're talking about. So anyway, in 1866, the Cherokee Strip had been given by the government to Native Americans for grazing purposes. And as the cattle herders came up, they would allow them to stay there. And some of them just kind of hung out there for a long time. And so the Cherokees realized that there was an opportunity for them to make some money. And they came up with something they called the cow custom, or basically a tax that they were asking people, you have your animals on our land, you're grazing them here, so we want you to reimburse us for that. I mean, it seems reasonable. Another thing that happened was that Kansas ranchers would allow their cattle to drift down and graze on the Cherokee land, and they would, so there are always people who try to evade paying money for different things, right? I mean, it always has been, it always will be. So some of these ranchers, Kansas had a tax on like property tax. They would charge them for the cattle that they owned. So they would drive their cattle down south into the Cherokee Strip when it came time to count cattle, so they wouldn't have to pay as much tax. And then when the Cherokees came to them and said, okay, it's time to pay up for grazing your cattle on our land, they would shift them, to put them back up north on their Kansas land, so they wouldn't have to pay that custom to the Cherokees. So anyway, but most people would pay this. It was a very small, I think it was like 40 cents a head is all that the Cherokees were asking. And so they continued to have this great relationship with the ranchers, and the ranchmen were regularly paying for these grazing privileges, and there was kind of an association that was being built. And one of the reasons for this association was to protect against trespassers and to combat fire, wolves, thieves, and other destructive agencies. It was like a cooperative of sorts, and they were going to all work together. But now remember, this is day before fences and things like that. So these are free range cattle. So while this grazing tax is being imposed, they established like a permanent place that people would have to go to pay their money. And they were trying to, there was an agent, one of the Indian agents, who was trying to help the Cherokees get the money that they were actually due. And he was aware that some people were not being completely forthright with them. And so the Department of the Interior becomes involved. Here we go. And the Cherokee authorities explained they were in possession and under the jurisdiction of the Cherokee Nation of Indians, and the Indians granted permits for grazing cattle. Well, the Department of the Interior would permit a lease to be negotiated for a term of years and would recognize it and protect the people who are making the lease. Anyway, communication back and forth. Are they not? Are we going to help? Or as the government, U.S. government, are we going to stay hands off? And so men occupying Cherokee Outlet with herds of cattle in late 1882, their operations were reported to the Department of the Interior. An issue was raised that for them, they wanted to remove the fences and other improvements on the lands within 20 days, and failing which they would be removed by the military. So they had to put up some fences then by this time because of thieves and herds mixing up, and the people from Kansas drifting down and all that. Well, the War Department again said, no, we're not going to get involved in this. And then there was this huge protest that began. We should have been looking at this map here. This protest began to rise up. And now we're kind of getting into some of the Oklahoma history that we teach to the kids at school. Because now it's, we're starting to see not just ranchers, but people who wanted to farm this land are starting to kind of creep down from Kansas. And we're going to get into what they were called here in just a minute. But so these ranchers who were here formed the Cherokee Strip Livestock Association. And you can see, look at all those cattle, and they're just grazing everywhere. But this Cherokee Strip Livestock Association was formed, and it was obtained from the Cherokee National Council for a term of 5 years, and was perhaps the largest organization in the world for the promotion of the livestock industry in that day, which I find that to be a really impressive little nugget, that the largest organization of its kind in the world. It was chartered under the laws of Kansas and embraced more than 100 individuals and firms. Its members held about 300,000 cattle on that Cherokee outlet with enormous numbers elsewhere. So the money, this is an interesting thing. So the money that was paid by the Livestock Association was always in gold or silver. That was the only money that the Cherokees were willing to accept. So right after the Civil War, the government was issuing, the U.S. government started issuing paper money, and then they called it greenbacks. And it was to kind of boost the economy of the whole nation and to try to help, what was that called? Reconstruction after the Civil War, and all that. And a lot of people were iffy about it because they didn't trust that it really had any value. And so the government said, well, you know what, here's the deal. We'll say dollar for dollar. If you don't like the paper money, you can turn it in and get a silver dollar from the bank. But they were kind of afraid there might be a run on the banks, and they did not have enough silver to actually cover all the dollar bills that they had printed out. I mean, there was money, there was gold and silver reserves, but it wasn't all made into coins. So they kind of took their word back on that. And I mean, it was just this whole thing. But they would only take Morgan silver dollars. The Cherokees would only take a Morgan silver dollar. I guess it was 100% silver maybe, or something like that, as opposed to an alloy. The U.S. had printed these greenbacks. And so I read an article about that the Cherokees would actually take a wagon and go someplace, and there would be a chest that had like 50,000 silver dollars in it, and they would count every one of them, and then they would take the chest back with them to just because that was the way they were going to do it. So they would take half a payment at a time. It was $100,000 a year. Anyway, I thought that was kind of a crazy thing. So anyway, the press started playing an important role in all of this, because the press would write stories about the ranchers and would paint them as almost like villains, how they were using their resources and their money to take control and to not allow farmers to have a chance at a livelihood. And they were just, they were just really portrayed in a negative way in the press. And I mean, we can see today the influence that the press has. It's always been that way. I thought that this was an interesting thing here. This was in Kansas, and this guy is talking, and he's talking to farmers who were looking to go down into Oklahoma to try to start farms. In other words, a group of boomers. And this is from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper. And Lizzie Johnson, the cattle queen of Texas, used to write articles for the Frank Leslie's newspaper and send them in to him. Isn't that so funny? I thought that that was a great little connection there. But at any rate, the boomers, this is a group of boomers that got arrested for going down into Indian territory. And so this feud began, and they wanted the unassigned lands to be opened up for settlement. And I'm not going to go into all of that part of Oklahoma history. And we've talked about that a little bit before, and we probably will again. But something I found out in this essay that I've been using as a source is the unassigned lands were also called Old Oklahoma. This is the first time I've ever seen them referred to as that. And I thought that that was interesting. So at any rate, we have the Cherokee Strip Livestock Association, all of their power, the cow towns that have been built up to accommodate the needs of cowboys. And then we have our boomers who are coming down, and the government, the Cherokee Strip Livestock Association wanted to, their lease ran out. And so they wanted to sign another lease. And by this time, the boomers had been in the press, and they'd all been kind of pushing the government. And so the government was like, okay, you know what? We are not going to allow any more leases for grazing these ranch cattle. We are going to instead offer to buy the land from the Cherokees. And the ranch association offered $3 an acre for the outlet. But the U.S. government only offered $1.25 an acre. And so the Cherokees turned them down. It wasn't even half the money that they could have made. And so then the government said, no more, we're not going to allow any more leasing. And so then it was, it took, let's see, what year was this? About 3 years. That started in 1890. The Cherokee Strip was given away in 1893 in the 5th and final land run. So 3 years later, they finally said, okay, we'll sell you the land, because that was 3 years that they didn't have that additional income. So for $1.40 an acre, that was the final offer that was made by the U.S. government. And so prior to statehood, this is what Oklahoma looked like. And we've looked at maps similar to this before, but we had the unassigned lands, or Old Oklahoma, right here in the center for the first land run. Here is the second land run. The third is Cheyenne Arapaho. The fourth is this little area here. The Cherokee outlet is the fifth. Now, I've always thought, okay, so this was 1889. In 1890, the Organic Act, through the Organic Act, we acquired no man's land or what we call now the Panhandle of Oklahoma. 1891 was this land run, 1892 here, 1893 here. Then this land was given out by allotment. Okay, that means this land was no longer considered, they sold the land, these tribes sold this land to the US government. They allotted it, made it into sections, or, you know, quarter sections, half sections, whatever they agreed to. The Native Americans were able to retain parts of it for themselves, and then the rest of it was given away. And then the same thing happened here. Well, then we had the 2 land lotteries. And then this area down here, this was the final grazing land left that where ranchers were allowed to lease and graze, and this was called big pasture. And when that was given out or sold, I think, then the last of the large grazing lands they were gone. The way this land was then finally taken by the government was they broke it down into allotments. And I mean, it took a long time. The Choctaw Nation was the last holdout. It was 1906 before they finally, I mean, gave in, I guess, basically to the pressure of the allotments. Now, the person who wrote this article said something I thought was interesting. He said, it should be noted that opening these lands to white settlement did not constitute taking the land from the Indian and giving it to the settler. The Indian did not use the land. As an economic factor, he was negligible. What really happened was the taking of the land from the ranchmen and giving it over to agriculture. So then that was when I realized that the person who wrote this article maybe was a rancher himself, or was somehow tied to the cattle ranch industry. I mean, facts are facts. A lot of the information that I've shared is factual. I feel like that statement is more of a personal opinion. There seems to be a bias attached to it, because I mean, I see it that regardless of whether or not the Native Americans were using the land for profit or whatever, it's their land. You know, it was their land to use as they saw fit. So I guess maybe he was just a really strong, you know, believed in capitalism or something. I don't know. But at any rate, the facts are that by 1906, the last of the land was allotted, and then in 1907, Oklahoma became a state. So here we have the land giveaways. I love that action picture right there. I don't know if that's a real one or a staged one, but it's a good looking one. And along came the farmers. Farming in Oklahoma was not for the faint of heart. This picture is hilarious. It looks like there's some kind of apparition over here. I think it's a dog jumping. You know how when they took pictures in the old days, the camera, the lens had to stay open for an extended period of time. And I think this man's dog must have jumped up or something because he's really blurred. But the farmers came in, they put up fences, they tore up the grazing land. A lot of them made sod houses out of them at first. But they took away all of that grazing area to plant crops, to sell, or to provide for their family. Some of the animals they brought perhaps brought some disease that affected the cattle as well. that tick-borne disease I was talking about that affected the buffalo herds to a degree. Well, I mean, they would have affected the cattle also. And so it made me think of the part from the Broadway musical Oklahoma, where the farmer and the cowman should be friends. Oh, Aunt May, or whatever her name was. I think it was it May? Anyway, she sings that song to the guys because the cattle ranchers and the farmers are at odds with each other. And I never really thought about how factual that was in the starting of our state, but it really was a thing. All of these cattle ranchers had been using this open range to graze their cattle. The cattle industry was huge. The cattle ranchers were very wealthy. And in the territorial governments, they probably had controlled a lot of what was going on, and then the farmers come in and they are taking small pieces of land, and there's bazillions of them, and any fences or grazing lands that the ranchers had used on the day of the land run, the fences went down. Sometimes they burned off the grass so they could clear the land more easily. And it was the article, he did kind of use some prose in this, but he talked about how as farming pushed westward across the United States, like east of the Mississippi, across the Mississippi, it's making its way towards what we call Oklahoma now. It was it was kind of like a leak in a dam. There was just this little leak, and it was just gradually when the land runs happened, April 22nd, 1889, there was no leak. The dam busted, and million people came rushing in and took all the land. And it was just that fast. And so the hope that a rancher might have of, pushing back or retaining some of it, it really was gone. And I can see where that would cause a conflict. But, we can look at it with a little fun, right? The farmer and the cowman should be friends. And, I think we've kind of come a long way. I am planning to talk more about some of the larger ranches, some of the ones that were able to hang on and maintain a large portion of land. And, there are some fairly large ranches still here in Oklahoma now, but I think it was probably more than a hanging on. I think it was probably a coming back in kind of thing. I don't know. I think we'll find out whenever we get there next week. But I hope you have enjoyed this. This was really a very interesting kind of timeline lesson, and just talking about the impact from the cattle drives to the way these ranchers saw the value of the land for grazing and for having an extra pasture for their cattle to have as they move these large herds around, and their cooperation and financial support of the different tribal nations, and just all of that working together. I mean, Oklahoma really does have such a unique history, and I loved being able to take just a deep dive and kind of learn about some of it. So anyway, tomorrow on Trail Talk, Gina Flesher and Cindy Parks from the Chisholm Trail Arts Council are going to join us and talk about some of their upcoming events, their concert series, and a lot of fun things that they're going to do. So be sure and tune in and see what they have to tell us. So anyway, I'll see you guys then. Happy trails.